The white tiles of the hospital ceiling drift into view. Then nothing, darkness. Then something else entirely. I wasn't in my body anymore, Maria Gonçalves would later tell researchers. I was looking down at myself. The doctors were working frantically, shocking my chest. A nurse was calling out numbers, and another was pushing something into my IV, but I felt completely peaceful, watching it all like a movie that had nothing to do with me. Maria, a 58-year-old accountant from Philadelphia, had suffered a massive cardiac arrest during what was supposed to be routine gallbladder surgery. For approximately 4 minutes and 20 seconds, her heart did not beat. By clinical standards, she was dead. There was a moment when I floated up through the ceiling, she continues, her voice steady despite the impossible geography she describes. I moved down a hallway, which I later confirmed looked exactly as I'd seen it, past the waiting room where my sister was crying into her hands. I wanted to tell her everything was fine, but I was being drawn away, pulled toward this extraordinary light. The light Maria describes has appeared in thousands of similar accounts. Warm but not burning, brilliant but not blinding, it seems to emanate not just radiance but understanding. Those who report encountering it often struggle to capture its quality with language built for ordinary perception. The next part is hard to explain, Maria says, her fingers twisting absently in her lap. I met others there. Beings of light, I'd call them. There was a life review, but not judgmental. More like understanding the ripple effects of every choice I'd ever made. I knew things about reality that made perfect sense then, but slipped away when I returned. And I did want to return, though part of me longed to continue toward that light. But something communicated to me, not yet. When Maria regained consciousness, she described surgical instruments and conversations she couldn't possibly have seen or heard while under anesthesia. Her cardiologist, initially skeptical, became disturbed when she accurately described the chaotic resuscitation scene, down to the color of socks he'd worn that day, visible only when he'd stepped on a footstool to adjust equipment above her body. What Maria experienced is commonly known as a near-death experience, or NDE, a phenomenon reported by approximately 10 to 20% of people who survive clinical death or come perilously close to it. While accounts vary, they often include elements like Maria's, a sensation of leaving one's body, moving through darkness or a tunnel, encountering deceased loved ones or spiritual beings, experiencing a life review, and confronting a boundary or decision point about whether to return to life. For centuries, such accounts were dismissed as hallucinations, oxygen-starved brain activity, or religious fantasies. Today, they occupy an uneasy position at the intersection of neuroscience, philosophy, psychology, and spiritual inquiry. They raise profound questions about the nature of consciousness itself. Is awareness merely a product of brain activity? Or might the mind somehow transcend its physical substrate? What makes near-death experiences so compelling, explains Dr. Bruce Grayson, professor emeritus at the University of Virginia and a leading NDE researcher, is not just their consistency across cultures and time periods, but the transformative impact they have on those who experience them. People like Maria often return with dramatically reduced fear of death, increased compassion, and a sense of meaning that reshapes their entire lives. Indeed, Maria quit her accounting job shortly after her recovery. I couldn't go back to focusing on spreadsheets and tax deductions, she says with a small laugh. Not after what I'd seen. The universe is so much vaster than we realize. I needed my life to reflect that understanding. Critics argue that these experiences, however profound they feel, are simply the result of predictable neurobiological processes. The sensation of leaving one's body, possibly a disruption in temporoparietal junction processing, the tunnel and light, perhaps related to oxygen deprivation in the visual cortex. The life review? Maybe the dying brain's memory centers firing chaotically. Dr. Kevin Nelson, a neurologist at the University of Kentucky, suggests that near-death experiences may result from REM state intrusions, essentially, the dream state bleeding into wakefulness during crisis. The brain is remarkably complex, he notes. It generates our entire subjective reality. When it's under extreme stress, unusual experiences shouldn't surprise us. Yet some elements of NDEs resist straightforward materialist explanation. How could Maria have perceived events outside her room while unconscious? How do we account for blind patients who report visual perceptions during NDEs? What about cases where patients accurately report conversations or events that occurred while they were clinically dead? These are the questions that keep scientists honest, says Dr. Sam Parnia, who leads the AWARE study at New York University. We need to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it challenges our existing paradigms about consciousness and the brain. The debate surrounding NDEs reflects deeper philosophical divides. On one side stand the survivalists, who believe these experiences offer evidence that consciousness can exist independent of the physical brain, suggesting the possibility of survival beyond bodily death. On the other side are the materialists who maintain that all mental phenomena, no matter how extraordinary, must ultimately reduce to neurobiological processes. Between these poles lie researchers committed to empirical investigation without predetermined conclusions. They design studies to test specific claims, placing hidden targets in hospital resuscitation rooms that would only be visible from above, analyzing the timing of conscious awareness against measured brain activity, and documenting verifiable perceptions during cardiac arrest. What makes this debate so charged is what lies at stake, not merely academic questions about brain function, but our most fundamental understanding of what it means to be human. Are we, as philosopher and psychologist William James put it, transmitters of consciousness rather than producers of it? Or are we, in the words of modern neuroscience, identical with our brains, our sense of self, a useful illusion generated by neural activity? For Maria Gonçalves, the theoretical debates pale beside the lived reality of her experience. I know what I saw, she says simply. I know what I felt. It changed everything for me. Death isn't an end, it's a transition. I don't just believe that, I experienced it. In the pages that follow, we will explore the near-death experience from multiple angles. We'll examine its defining features and variations across cultures. We'll trace its history from ancient accounts to modern scientific investigation. We'll meet the researchers who've dedicated careers to understanding it and the skeptics who've challenged their conclusions. We'll consider evidence both supporting and contradicting survivalist interpretations and explore how different disciplines from neuroscience to anthropology approach the phenomenon. We'll investigate how NDEs affect those who experience them, reshaping values, beliefs, and behaviors. We'll look at their portrayal in literature, film, and social media. And finally, we'll attempt to distill what can be responsibly claimed about these extraordinary experiences, separating established facts from speculation, while honoring the profound mystery that remains. The near-death experience sits at a unique crossroads between life and death, between science and spirituality, between what we know and what we wonder. Whether these glimpses beyond the threshold represent transcendent reality or the brain's final performance, they offer a compelling window into what matters most to human beings: connection, meaning, and the possibility that consciousness itself might be more profound and enduring than we've imagined. As Maria puts it, when you've been to the edge and looked over, you come back changed. You realize that all the boundaries we create between religions, between nations, between life and death, they look very different from that vantage point. They become transparent, and what remains is love, understanding, and a sense that everything is connected in ways we can barely comprehend. This is the territory we now enter, not with certainty, but with curiosity, not with dogma, but with questions. What happens when we die? What is consciousness? And what might near-death experiences reveal about both? The answers may reshape our understanding not just of death, but of life itself. The winter rain patters against the bay windows of Dr. Eleanor Weiss's office as she adjusts her glasses, the warm mahogany of her desk contrasting with the clinical precision of her notes. The recorder between us captures each syllable as we explore the contours of what happens when consciousness hovers at the threshold between life and death. To properly understand near-death experiences, she begins, her voice measured yet resonant, we must first establish what we're discussing. Her fingers trace the spine of a well-worn textbook. Terminology matters enormously in this field. I settle deeper into the leather armchair as she continues. Outside, Manhattan glistens under streetlights, the city oblivious to our conversation about its antithesis, the profound stillness that awaits us all. A near-death experience, or NDE, refers to a specific constellation of reported perceptions occurring during situations where death appears imminent, or occasionally during actual clinical death before resuscitation, Dr. Weiss explains, opening a journal filled with meticulous notations. These differ from out-of-body experiences, or OBEs, which can occur in less critical circumstances and typically involve only the sensation of leaving one's physical form. The distinction matters. Not all strange perceptions near death qualify as NDEs, and not all NDEs include an out-of-body component. The taxonomies of these liminal states require precision. We also encounter related phenomena, she continues, rain shadows dancing across her face. Deathbed visions, where the dying report seeing deceased loved ones, terminal lucidity, where dementia patients experience sudden clarity before death, and certain psychedelic experiences that mirror NDE components. Each has its own literature, its own phenomenology. Dr. Weiss moves to a glass cabinet, retrieving a framed document. For research purposes, we need operational definitions. The gold standard is the Grayson NDE scale, 16 questions measuring the presence and intensity of core features. She places the scale before me. Questions about feelings of peace, separation from the body, encounters with light, deceased relatives, and life reviews, all scientifically quantified, transformed into data points. To qualify as an NDE by these metrics, a person must score at least 7 points, she notes. But we're not merely counting points, we're cataloging profound human experiences. The scale categorizes situations that might precipitate an NDE, cardiac arrest, surgical complications, accidents, severe illness, even intense psychological crises without physical trauma. The boundaries are not always clear, the territories not fully mapped. The recording device blinks steadily as Dr. Weiss leans forward. Now, regarding prevalence, approximately 10 to 20% of cardiac arrest survivors report experiences meeting NDE criteria. That's remarkably consistent across studies. She pauses, adding, demographically, we find these experiences across all populations. Age doesn't seem determinative. Neither does biological sex, though reporting patterns vary culturally. A Saudi Arabian NDE narrative differs in certain details from an American one, yet core features persist. The rain intensifies as night deepens. Dr. Weiss stands, moving to a wall-mounted display showing brain scan images. These core phenomenological features follow patterns. Most begin with profound peace and well-being, even in objectively terrifying circumstances. I recall Subject X from another interview, a Wall Street executive whose helicopter crashed into the Atlantic. The moment I should have been most terrified was when I felt most serene, he had told me, bewilderment still evident years later. This is typically followed by a sense of separation from the physical body, Dr. Weiss continues. Experiencers report floating above themselves, observing medical procedures, hearing conversations. Some claim to perceive details they couldn't have known, though verifying such claims presents methodological challenges. Lightning momentarily illuminates her office, casting everything in stark relief. Appropriate, given the subject matter. The tunnel and light phenomenon comes next, she says, her voice taking on a softer quality. A dark passage leading toward brilliant, non-blinding light. The light is frequently described as sentient, loving, all-knowing. Her hand moves to another journal. Encounters follow with deceased relatives, spiritual figures, occasionally beings of light without specific identity. These encounters often involve telepathic communication rather than speech. Then for many comes the life review, she continues. Not simply a chronological playback, but an immersive reliving of one's actions with full awareness of their impact on others. Experiencers report feeling both the joy and pain they caused throughout their lives. I think again of Subject X, who described reviewing not just major life events, but seemingly inconsequential moments, giving a homeless man $5, ignoring his wife during an important conversation, each carrying unexpected emotional weight. Many experiencers report reaching a boundary, a river, a door, a wall of light, representing a point of no return, Dr. Weiss says, returning to her desk. They're often told or somehow understand that crossing this threshold means permanent death. And then the return, I offer. Wait, she nods, often reluctant. Many report being told they must go back, that their time hasn't come, that they have unfinished business. The return to physical sensation is frequently described as painful, constrictive-like, forcing oneself into an ill-fitting garment. The rain has stopped. Beyond the windows, Manhattan's lights seem dimmer, as though respectfully lowered for our conversation. The aftermath brings its own phenomenology, Dr. Weiss notes, consulting another journal. Reduced fear of death, increased spirituality, often without increased religiosity, greater compassion, shifts in values away from materialism toward relationships. Sometimes career changes, divorces, lives fundamentally reorganized around new priorities. She closes the journal deliberately. Now, classification is where consensus fragments. Some researchers categorize NDEs purely as subjective psychological events, the final productions of a dying brain. Others view them as potentially paranormal or spiritual experiences, suggesting consciousness may transcend physical processes. Her eyes meet mine directly, and some, myself included, recognize they may be both subjective experiences arising from neurobiological processes, yet potentially revealing deeper realities about consciousness and its relationship to physical matter. Dr. Weiss removes her glasses, suddenly looking more human, less clinical. The evidence doesn't yet allow us to dismiss either framework entirely. The materialist perspective offers robust neurological models, but struggles with certain verified perception cases. The transcendent interpretation addresses experiential consistency, but lacks falsifiability. She gestures to the wall of research journals. What fascinates me most is how consistent these experiences remain across cultures, religions, ages, even occurring in young children with minimal cultural programming about death. The specific interpretations vary, but the core phenomenology persists. Outside, dawn approaches. The city stirring to life forms a counterpoint to our conversation about its cessation. Some colleagues consider this work ultimately futile, chasing subjective reports impossible to verify, Dr. Weiss admits, gathering her notes. Others believe we're documenting the most important human experience possible, the transition beyond physical life. She smiles slightly. I simply believe in following evidence wherever it leads, even to uncomfortable places between established disciplines. The recording device blinks its final warning. Our time is ending. So we have a defined phenomenon, Dr. Weiss concludes, placing her journals into a leather satchel. But what causes it? Is it proof of something beyond physical reality, or the brain's final, magnificent hallucination? The interpretive camps are clear and deeply divided. She looks toward the lightening horizon, and that division reveals as much about our intellectual frameworks as it does about the experiences themselves. As I prepare to leave, I notice a small framed photograph on her desk I hadn't seen before. Dr. Weiss, younger, in a hospital bed, surrounded by medical equipment. I raise an eyebrow in silent question. My own cardiac arrest, 15 years ago, she says quietly, 7 minutes without heartbeat. That's why I study what I study. And did you? I begin. She smiles enigmatically, neither confirming nor denying, and opens the door to usher me out into the awakening city. The glow of computer screens lit Dr. Margolis's face as she leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent investigating phenomena most of her colleagues dismissed. The conference room felt too small for the tension it contained. Outside, Cambridge's autumn rain tapped against the windows like impatient fingers. I've seen patients describe details of their resuscitation they had no way of knowing, she said, removing her glasses. A woman who accurately described a nurse dropping a clipboard during her cardiac arrest. A man who reported the exact conversation between doctors while he was clinically dead. That demands explanation. Dr. Kaufman sighed, the skeptical neurologist's posture stiffening. His voice carried the practiced patience of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. What you call veridical perception is anecdotal. We know hypoxia, REM intrusion, endorphins can produce exactly these phenomena. The dying brain is not a reliable witness. Between them sat folders thick with case studies, brain scans, and testimonials, the contested evidence in what had become the most profound battleground in consciousness studies. Near-death experiences had divided the scientific community into camps with seemingly irreconcilable views of reality itself. The narrator's voice flowed over footage of brain imaging machines, hospital resuscitation teams, and interview subjects staring into middle distance, trying to articulate the ineffable. The debate around near-death experiences centers on fundamentally different interpretations of the same phenomena. Proponents argue that consciousness can function independently of the brain, that the mind somehow continues when the brain has ceased normal activity. They point to cases where people report accurate out-of-body observations during cardiac arrest, consistent cross-cultural elements regardless of religious background, and profound life transformations following these experiences. The scene shifted to Dr. Margolis in her office, surrounded by journals and books. A wall displayed photographs of patients she'd interviewed, hundreds of faces looking back with expressions that seemed somehow altered, as if they'd returned from somewhere bearing secrets. These experiences suggest consciousness is non-local, she explained. The consistency across cultures is remarkable. Whether you're Christian in Nebraska, Hindu in Delhi, or atheist in Stockholm, the core elements persist. This points to an objective reality being encountered, not mere hallucination. The camera panned across journal articles with highlighted passages about veridical perception during clinical death. charts showing after effects like decreased fear of death and increased compassion, and diagrams of the temporal lobe. Dr. Kaufman appeared in his laboratory, electrodes and brain models surrounding him like props in a science fiction film. His fingers traced neural pathways on a 3D model as he spoke. The brain doesn't shut down all at once. Even during cardiac arrest, there are periods of residual activity. We've documented how oxygen deprivation, endorphin release, and temporal lobe excitation create precisely these sensations of leaving the body, moving through tunnels, encountering light. It's beautiful neuroscience, not evidence of an afterlife. He pointed to a screen showing brainwave patterns. Religious and cultural expectations shape the content profoundly. A Christian sees Jesus, a Hindu sees messengers of Yama, an atheist sees a void or simply light. If this were truly perception of an objective afterlife, why such variation? The narrator continued as images of diverse religious iconography faded in and out. The content of NDEs themselves varies significantly. While media portrayals focus almost exclusively on blissful experiences, encounters with light, love, and departed relatives, researchers have documented multiple types. The lighting shifted to cooler tones as a middle-aged man identified only as Voice B appeared in silhouette. I was in darkness, falling, voices mocking me. It was hell, not heaven, he said, hands trembling slightly. Nobody wants to hear that. They want the tunnel, the light, the angels. But some of us come back terrified. The screen displayed a classification diagram. Researchers categorize NDEs into several types. The most commonly reported are blissful or transcendent experiences characterized by encounters with brilliant light, overwhelming love, and a sense of cosmic unity. Less frequently reported but well documented are distressing experiences, sensations of darkness, emptiness, or even torment. A third category involves experiences of the void states of pure, contentless awareness or infinite darkness that experiencers nonetheless describe as peaceful or meaningful. Dr. Margolis returned, her expression thoughtful. The after effects are perhaps our most compelling indirect evidence. People come back transformed, less materialistic, more compassionate, no longer afraid of death. Many report increased intuitive abilities or heightened sensitivity. Something profound has happened to them. Dr. Kaufman shook his head slightly. Memory is reconstructive by nature. These experiences often occur during trauma, when the brain's memory systems are compromised. Stories evolve with retelling, especially when surrounded by cultural narratives and media portrayals that shape expectations. The scene shifted to a comparative religion scholar examining ancient texts. Cultural variants of the experience reveal fascinating patterns, the scholar explained, turning pages of illustrated manuscripts. Western Christian experiences often feature Jesus or angels, judgments based on love rather than deeds, and heavenly landscapes. Hindu and Buddhist experiencers report encounters with Yama or his messengers, life reviews emphasizing karma and themes of rebirth. The camera panned across illustrated texts from diverse traditions, Islamic accounts of the Barzakh and angel interrogators, indigenous reports of ancestor spirits and animal guides, and secular interpretations emphasizing neurobiological mechanisms. Islamic NDEs frequently include elements from Quranic eschatology, the presence of recording angels, a period in Barzakh awaiting judgment, or meetings with departed relatives in paradise-like settings. Indigenous experiences across cultures often feature cosmological journeys guided by ancestors or animal spirits, reinforcing traditional worldviews about the interconnection of all life. A clinical psychologist entered the frame. Even atheists and agnostics report these experiences. They typically interpret the same phenomenology, light, peace, a sense of universal knowledge, through a neurobiological or psychological framework rather than a religious one. But the core experience remains remarkably consistent. The narrator continued as the camera moved through a hospital corridor where life and death balanced on the edge of medical intervention. This multiplicity of interpretations doesn't necessarily invalidate either side. Proponents suggest the variations reflect how different cultural frameworks interpret the same fundamental experience of transcending physical consciousness. Critics counter that these variations reveal how thoroughly cultural expectations shape what is ultimately a neurobiological phenomenon. Dr. Margolis and Dr. Kaufman appeared together again, the tension between them palpable yet respectful. "There's a third interpretation worth considering," Dr. Margolis offered. "Perhaps these experiences reflect a reality beyond our normal perception that gets filtered through our individual and cultural expectations. The light may be interpreted as Jesus, Krishna, or simply energy, but the encounter itself is with something real." Dr. Kaufman leaned forward. "Or perhaps the brain, in states of extreme stress, accesses deep evolutionary and psychological patterns common to all humans, creating experiences that feel profoundly real and significant. The universality comes from our shared biology, not a shared afterlife." The narrator concluded as the camera pulled back, showing the two scientists continuing their debate in the dimming light. The battle lines in this debate cut across not just scientific disciplines but world views. For proponents, NDEs provide tantalizing evidence that consciousness may transcend the brain, suggesting an afterlife, soul, or non-local consciousness. For critics, these experiences reveal the remarkable capabilities of the brain to create meaning even at the threshold of death, a neurobiological process shaped by cultural context and expectations. The rain outside had stopped, leaving Cambridge glistening under street lamps. Inside, the debate continued, each side armed with evidence, each convinced of their interpretation, each grappling with the profound implications of what happens when we approach death and, somehow, return to tell the tale. The screen faded to black as the narrator's final words hung in the air. These debates didn't emerge in a vacuum. To understand why NDEs exploded into public consciousness in the 1970s, we have to go back centuries back, in some cases. The antique clock on Professor Harrington's mahogany desk ticked steadily as she carefully removed a pair of white cotton gloves from her hands. Behind her, projected on the wall of her dimly lit university office, was an image of papyrus fragments, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics from the Book of the Dead. "Death has always fascinated us," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent studying humanity's most enduring mystery. "But what happens at the threshold between life and death? That question echoes across millennia." Rain pattered against leaded windows as Professor Harrington's fingers traced the edge of a first-edition copy of Plato's Republic. She turned to the myth of Ear, the tale of a soldier who died in battle, witnessed the afterlife, and returned to tell his story. Described souls being judged, choosing new lives and passing through a bright light before rebirth. 24 centuries ago, she mused, Plato was already documenting what we now call near-death experiences. Air's journey mirrors modern accounts with remarkable precision. The life review, the tunnel, the light, the feeling of being outside one's body. She moved to a glass display case containing a replica of the Bardo Thadol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, its pages worn with time and ritual use. Dating back to the 8th century, the text detailed the consciousness's journey after death through intermediate states before rebirth. Across the Himalayas, Tibetan Buddhists developed elaborate cartographies of the dying consciousness, she explained. They believed the mind encounters peaceful and wrathful deities, brilliant lights, and must navigate various illusory realms. The similarities to contemporary accounts are uncanny. Professor Harrington's silk scarf rustled as she crossed the room to retrieve a leather-bound volume of medieval visionary literature. The heavy book contained accounts of Christian mystics who claimed to have glimpsed heaven and hell: Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, Dante Alighieri. In medieval Europe, such visions were understood as religious experiences, she said, opening the book to a luminous illustration of souls ascending toward divine light. Muslim traditions similarly recorded mirage accounts, spiritual ascensions through celestial realms. Outside, lightning briefly illuminated the campus grounds. The professor moved to the window, watching raindrops streak the glass. The scientific interest began later, much later. In 1892, a Swiss professor named Albert Heim survived a near-fatal mountain climbing accident. The experience changed him. He began collecting accounts from other climbers who had fallen from great heights. They described time slowing down, panoramic memory reviews, unusual calm, and out-of-body perceptions. These weren't religious seekers, but mountaineers simply reporting what they had experienced while falling. She pulled a faded journal from her bookshelf, its pages filled with Heim's meticulous notes on these early accounts. Around the same time, psychical researchers like William James and Frederick Myers were investigating survival of consciousness beyond death. The Society for Psychical Research was collecting deathbed visions, apparition reports, and mediumistic communications. They were laying groundwork, but the world wasn't ready for systematic study of these experiences. The rain intensified as Professor Harrington settled into her leather chair, fingers steepled beneath her chin. Everything changed in 1975, she said. A young medical doctor named Raymond Moody published a slender volume called Life After Life. For the first time, someone had collected and systematically categorized these experiences, 150 accounts from people who had been clinically dead and resuscitated. She reached for a well-worn copy of Moody's book, its spine cracked from countless readings. Moody coined the term near-death experience and identified 15 common elements. The book became a surprise bestseller, selling over 13 million copies. Suddenly, millions had a name for what they or their loved ones had experienced but had been afraid to discuss. Lightning flashed again, closer this time. The professor's shadow stretched across the office walls as she continued. The timing wasn't coincidental. The 1970s represented a perfect confluence of factors. First, medical technology had advanced dramatically. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation techniques had been standardized. Intensive care units were becoming commonplace. Defibrillators were saving people who would have died just years earlier. Simply put, more people were being pulled back from clinical death than ever before. She moved to a wall of photographs, portraits of pioneering researchers in the field. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had already begun her groundbreaking work on death and dying, creating space for open conversation about mortality. The counterculture movement had embraced consciousness exploration, Eastern philosophy, and psychedelic experiences. Americans were reading Alan Watts and Ram Dass, practicing meditation and questioning materialistic worldviews. Professor Harrington paused at a photo of Kenneth Ring, a psychologist who founded the International Association for Near-Death Studies in 1978. Ring conducted the first major psychological study of NDEs in 1980, examining 102 cases. Around the same time, George Gallup Jr. conducted national surveys, suggesting that approximately 5% of Americans had experienced NDEs. Millions of people. Rain drummed steadily against the windows as the professor returned to her desk, opening her laptop to reveal a digital archive of research papers spanning decades. The 1980s and 90s brought more systematic research. Pediatrician Melvin Morse documented NDEs in children. Cardiologist Pim van Lommel conducted a landmark prospective study in Dutch hospitals. The famous case of Pam Reynolds, who deep hypothermic cardiac arrest for brain surgery and reported detailed observations, while demonstrably unconscious, challenged conventional explanations. She pulled up a brain scan image on her screen, bright patches of activity against the dark silhouette of a human skull. In 2008, Dr. Sam Parnia launched the AWARE study, attempting to objectively verify out-of-body perceptions during cardiac arrest using hidden visual targets in hospital rooms. In 2013, Jimo Borjigin's team at the University of Michigan recorded surge of gamma brain activity in dying rats that some interpreted as potential neural correlates of near-death consciousness. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Professor Harrington's fingers moved across her keyboard, bringing up a website filled with thousands of first-person NDE accounts. But perhaps the most significant development came with the Internet age. Websites like Near-Death Experience Research Foundation began collecting thousands of testimonies from around the world. Online forums created communities where experiencers could share anonymously. YouTube channels featured interviews with NDErs, reaching millions of viewers. She gestured toward the screen, where account after account scrolled past, stories from doctors, housewives, soldiers, children, atheists, believers. What was once whispered about in hospital corridors became publicly accessible. Cultural taboos eroded. Research papers that would have reached only specialized academic audiences were being discussed in online communities. The experiential data multiplied exponentially. The professor closed her laptop and walked back to the window. The storm was passing now, moonlight breaking through clouds to silver the wet campus grounds. "So we find ourselves at an interesting juncture," she said softly. Near-death experiences represent both our oldest stories and our newest frontier. They appear in our most ancient texts and our latest neural imaging studies. They've been interpreted through religious frameworks for millennia and scientific paradigms for decades. She turned, her silhouette outlined against the window. The experiences themselves seem remarkably consistent across time and culture, yet our interpretations of them are shaped by technology, terminology, and social context. A medieval peasant might have called it a vision of heaven. A 19th century spiritualist might have seen proof of the afterlife. A modern neuroscientist might describe it as a hallucination triggered by a dying brain. Professor Harrington returned to her desk, carefully placing Moody's book back among the collected works that chronicled humanity's persistent fascination with the boundary between life and death. What's most remarkable isn't just that these experiences occur, but that our relationship with them has evolved so dramatically. From religious visions to medical events, from private mysteries to public discourse, from supernatural to potentially natural phenomena. She glanced at a framed photograph on her desk, a younger version of herself with several pioneering NDE researchers at a conference. The history of near-death experience research isn't just about what happens when we die. It's about how we live, what we value, and how we make meaning of our mortality. It's about the tension between subjective experience and objective measurement, between ancient wisdom and modern science. The antique clock struck midnight, its gentle chimes reverberating through the quiet office. "So NDEs entered mainstream awareness," Professor Harrington said, gathering her notes. "But who drove the research forward? And who fought against it? That's where the real human drama unfolds, in the stories of the researchers, critics, and experiencers themselves." She switched off her desk lamp, leaving only moonlight filtering through the windows, illuminating centuries of human attempts to understand what happens when we approach, and sometimes cross, the threshold of death before returning to tell the tale. The golden hour cast long shadows through the windows of Raymond Moody's study, where thousands of books lined floor-to-ceiling shelves, medical texts beside volumes on philosophy and religious mysticism. It was here, in 1975, that the young physician first coined the term near-death experience in his groundbreaking book, Life After Life, launching what would become both a scientific inquiry and a cultural phenomenon. Outside, the University of Virginia campus was quiet as the day waned. 3 miles away, in a modern research facility, Bruce Grayson, psychiatrist, researcher, gentleman scientist, sat reviewing data with the methodical precision that had characterized his 4 decades of NDE research. His face, lined with years of academic battles and patient interviews, remained animated as he explained the Grayson scale to a young graduate student, a 16-point measurement system he had developed to quantify and standardize these profound experiences that defied easy categorization. "The question isn't whether these experiences happen," he said, his voice carrying the soft southern inflection of his adopted Virginia home. "They undeniably do. The question is what they mean." Across the Atlantic, Dutch cardiologist Pim van Lommel's office in Arnhem was bathed in the cool northern European light that painters had captured for centuries. On his desk sat copies of The Lancet, where his prospective study of NDEs among cardiac arrest survivors had sent shockwaves through the medical establishment in 2001. Van Lommel, whose precise manner and clinical background lent credibility to a field often dismissed by mainstream science, had followed 344 cardiac arrest survivors, documenting experiences that challenged purely materialistic explanations of consciousness. "When I began my research," he often told colleagues, "I was a skeptic. The evidence changed my mind." In London, psychologist Susan Blackmore was delivering a lecture on the dying brain hypothesis. Her theory that near-death experiences were nothing more than the last firings of an oxygen-deprived brain creating hallucinations, not glimpses of an afterlife. Once interested in parapsychology herself, Blackmore had become one of the field's most articulate skeptics, her punk rock hairstyle and direct manner making her a distinctive presence in academic circles. "What we're seeing," she told the audience of neuroscience students, "is the brain's last attempt to make sense of random neural activity. The tunnel, the light, the life review, these are predictable results of cerebral anoxia and temporal lobe activity." Neuroscientist Kevin Nelson nodded from the back row. His own research suggested REM sleep intrusion could explain many NDE features. The brain, he believed, slipped into a dreamlike state during crisis, producing the vivid imagery reported by survivors. Meanwhile, at the headquarters of the International Association for Near-Death Studies in Durham, North Carolina, volunteers fielded calls from experiencers seeking validation and understanding. Founded in 1981, IANDS had grown from a small support group to an international organization with affiliated groups in 20 countries. Its quarterly journal, peer-reviewed yet open to transcendent interpretations, occupied an uneasy middle ground between academic rigor and spiritual openness. At the University of Southampton in England, Dr. Sam Parnia directed the AWARE study, the most ambitious attempt yet to verify the reality of out-of-body perceptions during cardiac arrest. His team had placed hidden visual targets near ceilings in resuscitation areas across 15 hospitals on 3 continents, hoping to objectively test whether patients could accurately report seeing these images during their reported out-of-body states. "We're not approaching this as believers or skeptics," Parnia explained to a documentary crew filming his work. We're scientists following evidence wherever it leads. The evidence remained contested territory. Michael Shermer, founding publisher of Skeptic magazine and columnist for Scientific American, reviewed the latest NDE study with practiced scrutiny in his California office. A professional skeptic with a background in science history, Shermer had built a career challenging extraordinary claims. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, he said, quoting Carl Sagan, while examining methodology sections with a highlighter. And despite decades of research, the evidence for anything beyond brain function remains thin. At Johns Hopkins University, a team of anesthesiologists and critical care specialists discussed NDEs during their weekly conference. Their perspective was shaped by daily observations of unconscious patients, medications that induced hallucinations, and the complexities of measuring awareness. We see strange states of consciousness every day in our practice, said the department chair. The boundary between awareness and unconsciousness isn't binary. It's a spectrum with bizarre states in between. The conversation in medical settings contrasted sharply with discussions happening simultaneously at a New Age conference center in Sedona, Arizona, where Anita Moorjani spoke to a rapt audience about her 2006 NDE during end-stage lymphoma, an experience she credited with not just changing her perspective, but triggering her inexplicable physical healing. I didn't just see the light, she told the audience, her voice gentle yet confident. I became the light. Nearby, Dr. Eben Alexander signed copies of his bestseller, Proof of Heaven, the neurosurgeon's account of his own NDE during a severe case of bacterial meningitis had made him both a celebrity and a controversial figure in medical circles. Colleagues questioned how someone trained in neuroscience could embrace such seemingly unscientific conclusions. Supporters celebrated his courage in challenging materialist orthodoxy. My medical training made me the least likely person to believe in consciousness beyond the brain, Alexander told a woman waiting for his signature. That's why my experience was so transformative. Television producers mingled with the crowd, scouting for compelling stories for their next documentary. Since the 1990s, NDEs had become reliable content for networks from PBS to Discovery to History Channel, mysterious enough to attract viewers, profound enough to justify serious treatment. Online, other communities thrived. The Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, founded by radiation oncologist Jeffrey Long, had collected over 4,500 first-hand accounts in multiple languages through its website, creating the largest database of NDE testimonies in existence. Each submission was categorized, analyzed, and made available to both researchers and the curious public. Reddit's r/NDE forum hummed with activity as its 85,000 members shared stories, debated interpretations, and occasionally sparred with materialist skeptics who viewed the community as dangerously deluded. Moderators worked to maintain respectful dialogue in a space where the most profound human questions about death, consciousness, and meaning were discussed alongside the latest research studies. In hospital corridors across the world, quieter conversations took place. ICU nurses, often the first to hear patients' post-resuscitation stories, made crucial decisions about whether to document these experiences or dismiss them as confusion. Cardiologists, anesthesiologists, and palliative care teams found themselves serving as unofficial gatekeepers, their attitudes determining whether experiences were validated, recorded, or ignored. I've been an ICU nurse for 27 years, said Maria Gonzalez during a staff meeting at Boston General. I used to change the subject when patients described leaving their bodies or seeing deceased relatives. Now I listen. Their need to process these experiences is real, regardless of what caused them. At the Vatican Observatory, Where science and faith had maintained an uneasy dialogue for centuries, Catholic theologians discussed NDEs in relation to Christian teachings about the afterlife. Similar conversations unfolded in Islamic scholarly circles in Cairo, in Buddhist monasteries in Thailand, and among Hindu pandits in Varanasi, each tradition finding echoes of their teachings while grappling with elements that didn't neatly align with established doctrine. These experiences cross cultural and religious boundaries, observed a Jesuit priest astronomer. They challenge simplistic understandings of both science and faith. Within academia, the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies stood as a rare institutional space dedicated to rigorous research of phenomena that challenged materialist paradigms. Founded in 1967 by Dr. Ian Stevenson, the division had expanded its research beyond NDEs to include studies of children's memories of previous lives, apparitional experiences, and cases of remarkable mental abilities. "We're asking questions most academic institutions won't touch," explained Jim Tucker, who had continued Stevenson's research into children's past life memories. But these experiences demand serious investigation, not dismissal. At academic conferences, young researchers navigated career risks. Graduate students drawn to consciousness studies quickly learned which advisors would support NDE research and which would discourage it as career suicide. Grant applications carefully framed questions in terms of neuroscience and psychology rather than survival of consciousness. Junior faculty secured tenure before revealing interests in controversial areas. The commercial ecosystem surrounding NDEs had grown substantially since Moody's first book. Publishers maintained dedicated imprints for afterlife narratives that reliably sold to a public fascinated by glimpses beyond mortality. Conference organizers booked hotel ballrooms for events featuring experiencers alongside physicians and researchers. Professional speakers crafted presentations balancing personal testimony with scientific references. Behind it all were the experiencers themselves, the cardiac arrest survivors, the accident victims, the people who had approached death and returned with stories that had changed them forever. While researchers debated mechanisms and meanings, these individuals navigated life after experiences that had transformed their values, beliefs, and sense of purpose. "The academics can debate whether what I experienced was real," said a former financial executive who had survived a massive heart attack 5 years earlier. "But the love I felt, the life review I experienced, that changed everything about how I live now. That's real, whatever caused it." As evening fell across time zones, the researchers, critics, clinicians, and experiencers who populated the NDE ecosystem continued their work. Some in laboratories, some in lecture halls, some in support groups, all participating in a conversation about consciousness and mortality that had roots extending far beyond modern medical science. Behind their diverse perspectives lay older questions about mind and matter, spirit and brain, questions that had occupied philosophers since Plato distinguished between the body and the soul, questions that religious traditions had answered with doctrines of afterlife and rebirth, questions that early psychical researchers like William James had approached with pragmatic curiosity. These modern actors hadn't invented their positions from scratch. They had inherited centuries of thought about consciousness, reality, and what might happen when the body fails. Their contemporary debate about near-death experiences was simply the latest chapter in humanity's oldest and most persistent inquiry. What happens when we die, and what does that tell us about what it means to be alive? The moonlight spilled through the tall windows of the library at the Harrington estate, casting long shadows across leather-bound volumes that lined the mahogany shelves. Lawrence Harrington sat in a wing-back chair, his silver hair catching the soft illumination as he traced his finger along the spine of an ancient text. Plato's Phaedo. There's something profoundly unsettling about the persistence of the mind-body problem across millennia, Lawrence murmured to his guest, Dr. Eleanor Whitman, who occupied the adjacent chair. Plato's dialogues concerning the immortal soul don't feel dated, despite being written over 2,000 years ago. Eleanor, an anthropologist whose research on cross-cultural death rituals had brought her to Lawrence's attention, nodded thoughtfully. The fireplace crackled, sending occasional sparks dancing upward. The myth of air in the republics is particularly fascinating, Lawrence continued. A soldier presumed dead who returns to life with tales of judgment, cosmic order, and the soul's journey. The parallels to modern near-death experiences are remarkable. The wealthy philanthropist had built his fortune in medical technology, but had lately become obsessed with philosophical questions about consciousness. His library, valued at over $12 million, contained first editions of nearly every significant philosophical text addressing the afterlife. Philosophy gives us the intellectual architecture, Eleanor replied, accepting a glass of aged Bordeaux from Lawrence's butler. Descartes formalized what Plato intuited, that mind and matter might be fundamentally different substances. His cogito ergo sum provided the framework for centuries of dualism. The room fell silent, save for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum swinging with methodical precision. Outside, rain began to fall, droplets tapping against the leaded glass windows like hesitant visitors. "What fascinates me," Lawrence said, rising to approach a glass display case containing a rare first edition of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, is Kant's brilliant insight about the limits of human knowledge. We can never truly know the thing in itself, the noumenal realm. The afterlife, if it exists, may forever remain beyond our epistemological reach. Eleanor watched as Lawrence's fingers hovered reverently over the case. His wealth had purchased these treasures, but money couldn't buy the answers he sought. William James took a different approach, she offered. Rather than metaphysical speculation, he suggested we study religious experiences empirically on their own terms. His Varieties of Religious Experience opened the door to investigating transcendent states without necessarily endorsing supernatural interpretations. Lawrence turned, his expression brightening. "Precisely why I found your comparative work so compelling. You approach these phenomena as an anthropologist, cataloging, comparing, but withholding judgment about ultimate causes." The butler reappeared with a silver tray bearing small plates of delicate pâté and toast points. As he arranged them on the table between the scholars, Lawrence continued his philosophical exploration. Contemporary philosophers of mind have reframed the ancient questions. Thomas Nagel's "What is it like to be a bat?" and David Chalmers's articulation of the hard problem of consciousness, why subjective experience exists at all. These are modern echoes of Plato and Descartes. Eleanor sipped her wine thoughtfully. The questions endure because they touch something fundamental about human experience. Every culture I've studied has developed frameworks to understand death and what might lie beyond. Lawrence crossed to an illuminated display where artifacts from various traditions were arranged with museum-quality precision: a small Egyptian funerary figure, a Tibetan prayer wheel, a Byzantine icon depicting the Last Judgment. "The religious templates are striking in their similarities," Eleanor continued. "The Egyptian Book of the Dead guides the soul through judgment and transformation. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes Bardo's transitional states between death and rebirth. Christianity offers heaven, hell, and purgatory. Islam presents the soul's interrogation by angels, Munkar and Nakir." Lawrence nodded. The structure of near-death experiences often mirrors these ancient scripts. A life review that resembles judgment. Beings of light that could be guides or angels. a sensation of cosmic unity that parallels mystical traditions. He paused, considering. Does that mean the experience is merely culturally constructed, or that these traditions accurately recorded a genuine phenomenon? The fire popped loudly, sending a cascade of sparks up the chimney. Eleanor set down her wine glass. "The same question haunts my research," she admitted. "Dr. Ramirez, my colleague at Berkeley, likes to say that every culture has a way to frame death. NDEs plug into that framework. But that begs the question, why do these frameworks share such striking similarities across isolated cultures?" Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating the rain-streaked windows and casting the library in stark relief. Lawrence returned to his chair, leaning forward with intensity. "Science, too, has wrestled with these questions," he said. "The vitalism debates of the 19th century, whether living organisms possessed some non-physical vital force, prefigured our modern discussions about consciousness. The materialists seemingly won that battle." Eleanor nodded. "And the spiritualist movement, with its seances and mediums, prompted early psychical research attempts to apply scientific methods to survival questions. William James himself was involved with the Society for Psychical Research, only to have it all dismissed as pseudoscience by the early 20th century," Lawrence added. "The scientific establishment considered the matter closed, until modern resuscitation medicine inadvertently reopened it, wrapped in the legitimacy of cardiac care units and neuroscience." The grandfather clock chimed midnight, its resonant tones filling the library. Lawrence stood and crossed to a modern section of his collection, where contemporary neuroscience texts stood alongside works on quantum mechanics and consciousness studies. "Carl Jung offers yet another perspective," Eleanor said. "He might view the recurring symbols in near-death experiences, tunnels, light, beings, as manifestations of collective archetypes. The hero's journey of descent and return, death and rebirth, plays out in the mind of someone approaching death." Lawrence selected a volume from the shelf, Jung's Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, and returned to his seat. "The psyche preparing itself for transformation through universal symbols," he mused. "Yet that still leaves open whether these archetypes merely reflect psychological structures or connect to something beyond the individual mind." The rain intensified, drumming against the windows. Eleanor gazed into the fire, its dancing flames reflecting in her eyes. "What strikes me about this entire field," she said quietly, "is that we're not actually asking new questions. We're asking ancient questions with new technology, new vocabulary, new cultural contexts. Plato would recognize our debates. So would medieval theologians and 19th century spiritualists." Lawrence nodded slowly. "Way. The mind-body problem, the limits of knowledge, the nature of subjective experience, the possibility of survival. These questions have persisted because they resist simple answers." He closed the Jung volume and placed it carefully on the table beside him. "Neuroscience gives us correlations between brain states and mental experiences, but hasn't closed the explanatory gap. Religious traditions offer comfort, but require faith. Philosophy clarifies the questions, but often leaves the answers tantalizingly out of reach." Eleanor finished her wine and set the glass down with a gentle clink against the mahogany table. "This is why I value the anthropological perspective. It allows us to map the territory of human beliefs without having to plant a flag claiming final truth." Lawrence's gaze drifted to the rain-streaked windows. "Yet we still want to know, don't we? Not just academically, but personally. What happens when the light goes out? Is consciousness fundamentally physical, emergent from brain processes, but ultimately extinguished with them? Or is Plato's intuition correct, that consciousness is more fundamental, merely clothed in physicality for a time. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing orange in the darkened room. Eleanor studied her host's face, the lines of concentration, the searching eyes that had seen much of the world yet still hungered for deeper understanding. With all this history in mind, Lawrence said softly, perhaps we can finally ask the most important question: what does the evidence actually show? The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, marking the passage of time, that mysterious dimension through which consciousness moved, wondering about its own nature and ultimate destination. Outside, the storm continued, raindrops streaming down glass like tears. Inside, two figures sat in contemplative silence, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, wealthy in knowledge, yet humbled by the persistence of mystery. The moon cast silver ribbons across the polished mahogany desk, where Dr. Elizabeth Mayhew arranged her research papers with methodical precision. Outside her study windows, Manhattan glittered like scattered diamonds on black velvet. At 62, the neurologist had devoted 3 decades to studying near-death experiences, amassing evidence that both tantalized and frustrated her scientific mind. "Which pile convinces you tonight, Elizabeth?" her husband called from the doorway, 2 crystal tumblers of scotch balanced in his hands. She accepted the drink with a weary smile. "The evidence landscape remains stubbornly ambiguous, Richard. That's what makes it maddening." Elizabeth turned to a folder labeled Proponent Evidence and extracted a well-worn research paper. The consistency of NDE reports across cultures had always intrigued her. Patients from rural China to urban Brazil describing similar tunnels of light, deceased relatives, and life reviews despite vast cultural differences. While cultural details varied, Christians saw Jesus, Hindus encountered Yamaraj. The core architecture remained remarkably consistent. "The cross-cultural similarities are difficult to dismiss," she murmured. When a 10-year-old Japanese boy and an 80-year-old Kenyan woman describe nearly identical experiences without prior knowledge of NDEs, it gives one pause. Richard settled into the leather armchair across from her. "What about those cases where people report seeing things while clinically dead?" Elizabeth nodded, extracting the famous Pam Reynolds case file. Reynolds had undergone standstill surgery, her blood drained, body cooled to 60 degrees, heart stopped, and brain activity flatlined. Yet she later described the unusual surgical saw used to cut her skull and conversations between surgical staff, details later verified as accurate. "Pam Reynolds remains one of the most compelling cases," Elizabeth said, tracing her finger along the medical timeline. Her descriptions of surgical instruments and conversations occurred when her brain should have been incapable of consciousness by every conventional understanding. Her eyes drifted to other files, reports of congenitally blind individuals describing accurate visual perceptions during NDEs, despite never having experienced sight in their lives. Patients reporting accurate observations during cardiac arrest when EEG readings showed minimal brain activity. The long-term psychological transformations that followed NDEs, decreased fear of death, increased empathy, and spiritual awareness that persisted for decades. But the skeptical neurologist in her couldn't ignore the opposite shelf, where equally compelling counter-evidence sat in meticulous organization. "The critics make compelling arguments too," Elizabeth sighed, selecting another folder. "Pilots experiencing G-force, induced hypoxia report tunnels, lights, and out-of-body sensations remarkably similar to NDEs. The Winery studies are particularly convincing." Richard swirled his scotch thoughtfully. "What about those brain stimulation experiments?" "Yes, indeed. When neurosurgeons stimulate the temporal parietal junction, patients report leaving their bodies, floating above themselves, classic OBE phenomena. Olaf Blank's work is particularly compelling." Elizabeth spread more papers across the rich mahogany. Alternative explanations crowded the desk. REM intrusion into waking consciousness creating hallucinations, endorphin releases creating euphoria, ketamine-like effects from natural neurochemicals, and the controversial DMT hypothesis suggesting endogenous hallucinogens might flood the dying brain. Then there's memory, she continued. We know witness memories of traumatic events are notoriously unreliable, subject to contamination, reconstruction, and cultural scripting. In the chaos of resuscitation, fragmented perceptions may be reconstructed into coherent narratives only later. The Manhattan penthouse fell silent, save for the distant symphony of traffic 40 stories below. Elizabeth's wealth had afforded her the luxury to pursue this research independently, free from institutional pressures that might color her conclusions. Let's examine specific cases more critically, she suggested, removing her designer glasses. Pam Reynolds, remarkable, yes, but critics point out the timeline remains disputed. Some consciousness may have been possible during induction or emergence from anesthesia. Bone conduction could explain how she heard conversations despite earplugs. She moved to another file. Eben Alexander's case created quite a media sensation, but the Esquire investigation revealed his coma wasn't as deep as his book suggested, and he likely had some awareness during periods classified as unconscious. Richard leaned forward. What about those reports from blind people? Fascinating but problematic. The samples are exceedingly small, and alternative interpretations exist. Even congenitally blind individuals have neural visual processing centers that could generate visual-like experiences without external stimuli. Elizabeth turned to another leather-bound folder containing results from controlled studies. Sam Parnia's AWARE study had placed targets in resuscitation rooms facing the ceiling, visible only from above, testing whether patients reporting out-of-body experiences could identify them. No confirmed visual hits, she noted. One patient reported awareness and accurate details of resuscitation procedures, but never saw the visual targets placed specifically for the study. That's the pattern we keep encountering. Compelling subjective experiences with tantalizing hints of veridical perception, but no slam-dunk evidence. The couple moved to the balcony, Manhattan's light pollution obscuring all but the brightest stars. The cool autumn air carried the scent of Elizabeth's orchid collection. The AWARE's second study improved methodology with continuous EEG monitoring and automated target presentation, Elizabeth continued, but results remain inconclusive. Critics point out methodological limitations, while proponents emphasize the difficulty of capturing these fleeting experiences under controlled conditions. She pointed to a file on animal studies. Jimo Borzhigin's team detected surges in gamma brainwaves in dying rats, potentially explaining heightened consciousness near death. But critics note rats aren't reporting subjective experiences, and the gamma surge occurs in a tiny window that can't explain elaborate NDE narratives. Richard topped off their drinks from a crystal decanter. After 3 decades, where do you think the evidence actually stands? Elizabeth's gaze swept across the city skyline, the lights of countless lives burning against the darkness. The strongest evidence supports 3 conclusions. NDEs definitely happen as phenomenological experiences. They share core features across cultures and medical circumstances, and they produce profound, lasting psychological transformations. She sipped her scotch, letting the smoky warmth linger. Moderately strong evidence supports various neurobiological correlates and partial mechanisms. We understand some contributing factors: oxygen deprivation, neurochemical cascades, temporal lobe activity. Richard nodded. And the weakest evidence? Claims that consciousness survives without brain function and that experiencers perceive verifiable external reality while clinically dead. Elizabeth gathered her papers. We have suggestive anecdotes, but not the kind of robust, replicated evidence science requires for extraordinary claims. The couple stood silently, two wealthy figures alone with existential questions their fortune couldn't answer. From their penthouse sanctuary, death seemed distant, yet inevitably approaching, a final frontier that neither their money nor science had fully mapped. "It's not science versus faith," Elizabeth mused. "It's incomplete science versus extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence. Both sides make the same mistake, assuming we understand consciousness well enough to make definitive claims." Richard embraced his wife, so the evidence landscape remains ambiguous. "Beautifully, maddeningly ambiguous," Elizabeth agreed. "Different disciplines naturally emphasize different aspects of the same evidence. What a neuroscientist sees as a brain shutting down, a religious scholar might see as a soul transitioning. The philosopher questions what real even means when discussing subjective experience." She gathered her papers, decades of research that had brought her to a place of educated uncertainty. "The evidence isn't messy because people are dishonest. It's messy because we're probing the boundary where objective measurement meets subjective experience, where the physical brain meets the experienced mind." Elizabeth closed her research folders, but not the question they contained. Tomorrow she would attend another wealthy benefactor's dinner party, where conversations about mortality inevitably arose among those with enough money to postpone, but never escape their rendezvous with death. The rich, too, sought comfort in narratives of continuation. She would tell them what the evidence landscape truly revealed, that we stand at the edge of multiple mysteries, consciousness, perception, and death, with fragmentary maps and imperfect tools, reaching for certainty where perhaps only probability exists. In her wealthy circles and beyond, the human need for answers often outpaced the evidence available to provide them. The night breeze carried the scent of jasmine through the open windows of Dr. Eleanor Richfield's Malibu study. The renowned neuroscientist gazed at the moonlight dancing across the Pacific as she absent-mindedly traced her finger around the rim of her crystal whiskey glass. On her mahogany desk lay stacks of brain scans, evidence of what happens when the mind approaches death. "I've spent 40 years mapping the dying brain," she murmured to her colleague, Dr. James Whitfield, who sat opposite her in a leather armchair worth more than most people's monthly rent. "And still, we've barely scratched the surface." The soft glow of her desk lamp illuminated the images: temporal lobe activity captured during cardiac arrests, gamma wave bursts, oxygen deprivation patterns. Each scan told a fragment of a story about consciousness at life's threshold. "The hypoxia model makes perfect sense," Eleanor said, selecting one particular scan. "As oxygen levels fall, inhibitory neurons die first. The excitatory neurons fire wildly, creating that cascade of visions, the tunnel, the light." James nodded, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "But it doesn't explain the coherence of the experiences. Random neural firing should produce chaos, not narratives." Eleanor smiled thinly. "That's where REM intrusion becomes compelling. The brain's sleep mechanisms activate inappropriately during crisis. The same circuitry that generates dreams creates these experiences." Outside, the waves crashed against the cliffs below her estate. The rhythmic sound reminded her of EEG readings, the brain's electrical symphony playing its final movement. "The methodological hurdles are immense," she continued. "How do you capture real-time neural activity in emergency situations? By the time we get people hooked up to equipment, the most critical moments have passed." "The timing problem," James agreed. "We're always studying the aftermath, never the event itself." Miles away, in the marble-floored library of his Bel Air mansion, Dr. Marcus Levin, the famed philosopher of mind, was hosting his weekly salon. Academics in designer evening wear sipped vintage champagne as they debated consciousness itself. Near-death experiences thrust the mind-body problem into stark relief, Marcus declared, his voice resonating through the vaulted ceiling. If consciousness is entirely produced by the brain, then these experiences must be explicable in neurobiological terms. But what if they're not? Challenged Dr. Sophia Chen, adjusting her jade bracelet. What if they reveal something about consciousness that transcends physical explanation? Marcus smiled. Then we confront the hard problem that Chalmers articulated. Why is there subjective experience at all? NDEs intensify that question. They push us to the limits of materialist explanation. The evidential weight of first-person reports cannot be dismissed, added Professor Richard Bennett, his British accent lending gravity to his words, but neither can they be accepted uncritically. Precisely, Marcus said, lifting his glass. The dualist sees in these accounts evidence for mind-brain separation. The physicalist sees remarkable brain activity under extreme conditions. Both interpret the same data through different metaphysical lenses. The conversation paused as servants brought in trays of delicate canapés on silver platters. What fascinates me, Sophia continued, is how psychological models intersect with these philosophical questions. Are NDEs extreme stress responses? Dissociation mechanisms? The mind's attempt to maintain coherence during system breakdown? Richard nodded thoughtfully. Psychology gives us frameworks for understanding how memory, schema, culture shape these experiences, how meaning is created from neural chaos. And yet, Marcus said, these experiences transform people. Whatever their origin, they have profound psychological effects. The integration challenges afterward, reconciling such extraordinary experiences with ordinary life. That's where psychology has much to offer. The night deepened as their conversation flowed like the expensive wine they consumed. In the softly lit meditation room of her Hamptons Retreat Center, Dr. Amara Patel sat cross-legged on a silk cushion. Around her, religious scholars from traditions spanning the globe had gathered for her invitation, only symposium on death and transcendence. Hindu tradition has long described experiences that mirror modern NDEs, she explained. The Upanishads speak of the soul traveling along the pathway of the gods. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes consciousness transitioning through bardos. Rabbi Goldstein stroked his silver beard. Yet we interpret these experiences quite differently. In conservative Jewish thought, these might be preparatory visions granted by God. In more liberal interpretations, they might reflect universal human consciousness structures. Father Thomas, a Jesuit priest with degrees in both theology and neuroscience, added, "Within Christianity, we see a spectrum of responses. Some traditionalists view these experiences as potentially demonic deceptions when they contradict doctrine. Others see confirmation of divine love and afterlife. In Islamic tradition, said Professor Khalid, the soul's journey after death is described in the Hadith. Some scholars see NDEs as glimpses of Barzakh, the intermediate realm between death and resurrection. What fascinates me, Amara said, is how religious frameworks determine meaning. The same experience meeting deceased relatives in a realm of light might be interpreted as union with Brahman, a foretaste of heaven, or a psychological projection. Outside, the ocean whispered against the private shoreline of her estate. The sound reminded her of impermanence, a central teaching in her Buddhist practice. Conservative and liberal theological responses often reflect deeper concerns about authority and tradition, Father Thomas observed. When NDEs suggest universal salvation regardless of faith, traditionalists grow concerned about doctrinal boundaries. Rabbi Goldstein smiled. As they say, where you stand depends on where you sit. In downtown Manhattan, the penthouse conference room of the Whitfield Foundation hummed with activity. Sociologists and anthropologists had gathered for a private symposium on death narratives across cultures. Dr. Victoria Montgomery, whose research on death rituals had been funded by the Foundation's considerable endowment, addressed the assembled scholars. Near-death experiences function as cultural narratives that encode values, she explained, gesturing toward data visualizations projected on the wall. Western NDEs typically emphasize individualism, personal life reviews, individual choice to return. Eastern accounts often highlight collective responsibilities and ancestral connections. These narratives serve social functions beyond their truth value, added Dr. Carlos Rodriguez. They provide continuity of identity beyond death. They reinforce moral codes through life review experiences that judge personal actions. Victoria nodded. Yes, exactly. In traditional societies, NDE accounts often reinforce existing power structures and moral codes. The tribal chief who returns from death with messages from ancestors strengthens both his authority and cultural traditions. The media dimension is fascinating, interjected Professor Jang, adjusting her designer glasses. Films like Flatliners, What Dreams May Come, books like Proof of Heaven, they don't just report these experiences, they actively shape cultural expectations. Creating scripts that influence future experiences, Carlos agreed. When someone approaches death having seen these depictions, their experiences may conform to established patterns. Victoria moved toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city. Media and communication studies show us how these narratives spread, mutate, gain cultural currency. Social media has democratized NDE sharing, creating new mimetic patterns. As the evening progressed, the conversation in each location deepened but remained distinct, separated by discipline, methodology, and worldview. Later that night, Eleanor Richfield stood on her balcony, watching the moonlight on the waves. She thought about the conversations happening across the country, philosophers debating dualism, religious scholars interpreting visions, sociologists analyzing cultural patterns, all circling the same phenomenon from different angles. "James," she said as her colleague joined her, "do you ever wonder if we're all like blind men describing different parts of an elephant?" He laughed softly. The neuroscientist focuses on brain activity, the philosopher on metaphysical implications, the theologian on spiritual meaning, the psychologist on coping mechanisms. "And none of us seeing the whole," Eleanor finished. "Our methods determine our questions determine our answers." "Perhaps that's why this phenomenon remains so compelling," James suggested. "It resists reduction to any single framework." Eleanor nodded, thinking of the brain scans on her desk. "Science gives us models: hypoxia, REM intrusion, temporal lobe activity. But models aren't reality. They're maps of territory we're still exploring." The ocean breeze carried the scent of night-blooming flowers. In the distance, lights from passing ships moved slowly along the horizon like consciousness itself, a signal moving through darkness. "These interpretations aren't just academic," Eleanor said quietly. "They shape real lives, real deaths, real societies. How we understand these experiences affects how people face mortality, how clinicians treat the dying, how we all make meaning from the inevitable." James raised his glass. "To the disciplines that divide the elephant among them, may they eventually compare notes." Eleanor smiled and clinked her crystal against his. "And to the elephant itself, whatever it may be." In mansions and penthouses across the country, the conversations continued long into the night. Neuroscientists with their brain scans, philosophers with their thought experiments, theologians with their ancient texts, sociologists with their cultural analyses. each discipline illuminating one facet of a phenomenon that continued to elude complete explanation, like the distant stars above Eleanor's Malibu estate, brilliantly visible yet impossibly far away. The man across from me smiled faintly, his eyes holding the gentle wisdom that comes from having walked through fire and emerged transformed. His suit was perfectly tailored, but he wore it differently now, as if the fabric was merely incidental to the person within. One could sense he'd once defined himself by such sartorial armor. Mine, like IMS, no longer. I quit my corporate job 6 weeks after I came back, David said, running his finger along the rim of his untouched coffee. 22 years at the same investment firm. Owner office, 7 figures. It is gone. He laughed softly. My colleagues thought I'd had a breakdown. Maybe I did, just not the kind they understood. The restaurant hummed with the quiet energy of Manhattan's financial district. Outside, streams of ambitious professionals hurried past, their reflections caught momentarily in the polished windows before dissolving back into the flow. David had once been among them, hungry, driven, certain. My marriage almost ended, he continued, his voice dropping. Caroline couldn't understand why I'd changed. The man she married was decisive, ambitious, focused on building wealth. The man who came back from death wanted to give away money, meditate, talk about consciousness. He shook his head. I told my cardiologist about what I'd experienced during those 4 minutes, and he patted my shoulder, said it was ICU psychosis. I felt so alone. David's near-death experience had occurred during a massive cardiac event 3 years ago. What happened in those 4 minutes had altered everything that followed. The hardest part wasn't the experience itself, he said. It was returning to a world that couldn't comprehend what I'd seen, what I now knew. His story echoed hundreds I'd documented, the profound aftermath that ripples outward when someone returns from the threshold. The reduced materialism, often dramatic career changes, spiritual seeking, but also the marital strain, the alienation, the struggle to reintegrate into a society built on values that suddenly seemed hollow. In Baltimore, I'd interviewed a woman named Teresa whose NDE had occurred during childbirth. My husband divorced me, she'd said simply. He said I became too weird. But how do you go back to caring about vacation homes and stock portfolios after you've experienced infinite love? How do you unsee what you've seen? Not all experiences leave such benevolent impressions, however. Richard, a former police officer from Phoenix, had shared his distressing NDE with palpable discomfort. Mine wasn't the light and love story, he'd told me, hands trembling slightly as he spoke. I experienced emptiness. Vast, endless void. Nothing. Not darkness. Darkness is something. Yawns. This was nothing. I had nightmares for years afterward. My distressing NDE left me terrified of death. The therapists I saw weren't equipped to handle it. They wanted to medicate the fear away rather than help me understand it. The clinical implications of these experiences extend far beyond the individuals themselves. How medical professionals respond to patients reporting NDEs can profoundly impact trust, disclosure, and healing. Dr. Eleanor Whitman, a palliative care specialist at Mount Sinai, explained the delicate balance required. When a patient shares an NDE with their doctor, that moment becomes pivotal, she'd said during our interview in her sunlit office overlooking Central Park. If the clinician dismisses it as hallucination or brain dysfunction, they may lose that patient's trust forever. If they validate it without critical inquiry, they may reinforce potentially harmful interpretations. We aim for the middle path, honoring the profound subjective reality while maintaining clinical perspective. These experiences increasingly influence end-of-life planning. Some NDE experiencers request DNR, do not resuscitate orders, wanting to return to the light if dying again. Others become passionate advocates for comprehensive advance directives. The ripple effects touch every aspect of how we approach mortality in medical contexts. I've had patients completely revise their advance directives after NDEs, Dr. Whitman had noted. Some who previously wanted everything done now request minimal intervention. Others go the opposite direction, feeling they have unfinished business. These experiences profoundly reshape how people conceptualize their own deaths. Back in the restaurant, David looked thoughtfully out the window. Caroline and I eventually found our way back to each other, he said. Not as the couple we were, but as something new. She attended a support group for spouses of NDE experiencers, heard stories similar to ours, realized she wasn't alone either. Support groups have become crucial sanctuaries for those navigating the aftermath. In church basements, hospital conference rooms, and increasingly online, experiencers gather to share their stories without fear of judgment. These communities provide validation and practical coping strategies for those feeling caught between worlds. The group saved me, explained Sophia, a retired teacher whose NDE occurred during surgery. For months, I felt like I was living in two realities simultaneously, this physical world and the greater reality I glimpsed. I couldn't talk about it with friends or family. They'd get uncomfortable, change the subject. In the group, I found people who understood that feeling of having one foot in each world. For clinicians, these support networks provide essential resources. Dr. James Corbett, a psychiatrist specializing in NDE integration therapy, emphasized their importance. Traditional therapy models aren't always equipped for NDE aftermath, he'd explained during our video interview. We're dealing with experiences that challenge fundamental assumptions about reality, consciousness, and death. When patients struggle with post-NDE depression or anxiety, it often stems from existential displacement rather than chemical imbalance. The mental health dimensions are particularly complex with distressing NDEs. While blissful experiences can provide comfort around death, frightening ones can trigger PTSD-like symptoms. Individuals may fear sleep, develop severe death anxiety, or struggle with depersonalization. It's a clinical blind spot, Dr. Corbett had noted. Distressing NDEs receive far less research attention despite potentially causing greater psychological harm. And the void experiences, like Richard's, are particularly underrepresented in literature and support resources. The relationship between NDEs and suicide presents another complex dimension. Research suggests paradoxical effects. While positive NDEs often reduce suicide risk by alleviating death anxiety and increasing sense of purpose, some experiencers develop what researchers term re-entry problems, profound depression upon returning to ordinary reality after glimpsing something transcendent. Dr. Miranda Chen, suicidologist at UCLA, had carefully explained the nuances. For most, NDEs serve a protective function against suicide. Having experienced something that suggests consciousness continues, they're less likely to view death as escape. However, we've documented cases where individuals become so homesick for what they experienced that ordinary life becomes unbearable. The clinical community is still developing best practices for identifying and supporting those at risk. Beyond individual impacts, NDEs have catalyzed broader cultural shifts. They've become central to the death positivity movement, challenging taboos around mortality discussions. The International Association for Near-Death Studies has grown from a small academic interest group to an organization with chapters worldwide, hosting conferences that draw thousands. These experiences create fascinating tensions with both institutional religion and secular materialism. Some experiencers leave traditional faith communities after NDEs contradict specific theological doctrines. Others return to religion with renewed conviction. Many develop syncretic spiritual frameworks that draw from multiple traditions. My Catholic upbringing didn't prepare me for what I experienced, explained Father Michael Delmonico, a priest whose NDE occurred during a heart attack. There was no judgment, no pearly gates, just love beyond comprehension. I remain committed to my vocation, but with a more expansive understanding of divine mercy than church doctrine sometimes allows. Meanwhile, secular materialists who experience NDEs often find themselves in philosophical crisis. Dr. Elaine Northrup, a formerly atheist neurologist who had an NDE during surgery, described her cognitive dissonance. I built my career on the understanding that consciousness is produced by the brain, she'd told me. Then I had this experience of heightened awareness when my brain was demonstrably compromised. It created a schism between my scientific training and my lived experience that I'm still reconciling. David finished his water and finally took a sip of his cold coffee. His eyes held a complex emotion, not quite sadness, not quite joy. People ask if I'm grateful for my NDE, he said thoughtfully. It's complicated. I lost friends who couldn't relate to me anymore. My parents think I joined a cult. I gave up a career I'd worked decades to build. But I gained something immeasurable, the absolute certainty that we are more than our bodies, that love persists, that consciousness is fundamental. He smiled slightly. Was it worth it? Ask me in another lifetime. As we prepared to leave, David mentioned he'd been invited to speak at a hospice training program. Increasingly, medical institutions are recognizing the potential therapeutic value of NDE narratives in end-of-life care. Hospice workers report that sharing these accounts thoughtfully, without dogmatic interpretation, often provides comfort to dying patients and their families. I tell them what happened to me, David said, not as proof of anything but as a possibility. Just knowing that thousands of people across cultures have reported similar experiences seems to bring peace. In that space of uncertainty and fear, even possibility matters. Outside, the autumn air carried a hint of wood smoke. David paused on the sidewalk, watching the stream of hurried pedestrians with compassionate detachment. The strangest thing, he said quietly, is that the experience itself lasted only moments. But I'll spend the rest of this lifetime integrating it. He extended his hand. Thank you for listening. For not trying to explain it away or insist it was real. Just for hearing it as it happened to me. As he walked away, merging into the flow of the city, I thought about all the stories I'd collected, thousands of accounts from people forever changed by glimpsing whatever lies beyond our ordinary perception. Their experiences had altered marriages, careers, religious beliefs, and medical decisions. They'd triggered scientific debates, theological reconsiderations, philosophical inquiries. And then Hollywood arrived. So did the internet. And NDEs became something else. Entertainment, meme, commodity. But that's another story entirely. The limousine glided through the rain-slicked streets of Culver City, its tinted windows reflecting the neon lights of the Sony Pictures lot. Inside, Franklin Reynolds tapped a Mont Blanc pen against his leather portfolio, the rhythmic click, click, click betraying his nervousness despite the assured set of his jaw. As one of Hollywood's most successful producers, he rarely felt this kind of anxiety, but today's pitch meeting was different. The studio execs won't go for it, his assistant said, scrolling through emails on her tablet. Near-death experiences as the central premise? It's box office poison. Franklin's eyes drifted to the passing studio gates. That's what they said about Flatliners back in '90, and look what happened. Joel Schumacher turned it into a cultural phenomenon. Kiefer Sutherland, Julia Roberts, Kevin Bacon, all playing medical students experimenting with death. He smiled thinly. It grossed $60 million on a $26 million budget. That was 35 years ago, his assistant countered, and the 2017 remake bombed. The car stopped at a security checkpoint. Franklin watched the guard wave them through, rain purling on the windshield. The remake failed because it misunderstood what made the original work, Franklin said softly. It wasn't just about the thrill of crossing over, it was about consequences, guilt, the past haunting the present. The NDE was a vehicle for character exploration, not the destination. Inside the executive building, Franklin moved with practiced confidence toward the elevator. The walls were adorned with posters of the studio's recent successes, franchise tentpoles, superhero sagas, animated features. Nothing remotely resembling what he wanted to pitch. Peter Weir understood, he continued as they ascended. Fearless was brilliant. Jeff Bridges playing a plane crash survivor who has an NDE that transforms him, makes him fearless, disconnected from normal life. It wasn't marketed as an NDE film, but that's what gave it its power. The elevator doors opened to reveal a minimalist reception area where a young man with an earpiece nodded them toward the conference room. As they walked, Franklin's mind cataloged the cinematic history he was hoping to build upon. Clint Eastwood's Hereafter with Matt Damon as a reluctant psychic who can communicate with the dead after his own near-death experience. The surprise hit Heaven is for Real, based on the best-selling account of a 4-year-old boy's alleged journey to heaven during emergency surgery. The conference room was already occupied by 5 executives in various stages of distraction, scrolling phones, sipping lattes, muttering to each other. Franklin set his portfolio down and took a deep breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "our culture has an obsession with what happens when we die. But we've been telling the same story over and over. The tunnel, the light, the dead relatives welcoming the protagonist. It's become a cliché, a shorthand. I want to explore the full spectrum." He tapped his tablet, bringing up a slideshow on the wall screen. Images appeared, Britt Marling in the OA, performing strange movements meant to open portals between dimensions, a scene from Black Mirror's San Junipero episode, a still from the Thai film Mindfulness and Murder. When the OA debuted on streaming, it took an entirely fresh approach to near-death experiences, making them gateways to abilities, to other dimensions. It created a cult following because it respected the audience's intelligence while still delivering emotional payoff. Franklin clicked to the next slide book covers. Raymond Moody's Life After Life started it all in 1975, cataloging the common elements across hundreds of cases. Then came the memoirs, neurosurgeon Eben Alexander's Proof of Heaven, claiming his cortex was completely inactive during his coma, making his vivid experiences impossible from a materialist perspective. One of the executives raised an eyebrow. Wasn't Alexander's account discredited? I remember reading something about how his coma wasn't as deep as he claimed. Franklin nodded, appreciating the engagement. Esquire ran an investigation questioning several of his claims. Similarly, Anita Moorjani's bestseller Dying to Be Me, about her cancer spontaneously remitting after an NDE faced medical scrutiny. That's exactly my point. These stories live at the intersection of personal truth, cultural myth, and scientific skepticism. He paced now, warming to his subject. Heaven is for Reals became a publishing phenomenon, then a successful film, by packaging the NDE into a Christian-friendly narrative. 4-year-old Colton Burpo supposedly meeting Jesus, his miscarried sister, and his great-grandfather in heaven. It's compelling because it confirms what many already believe. "So what exactly are you pitching?" asked a woman at the far end of the table, her tone suggesting she'd heard enough preamble. Franklin smiled. "An anthology series called Threshold. Each episode follows a different NDE, some blissful, some terrifying, some ambiguous. We represent cultures beyond the Western Christian template. We show how these experiences transform lives or don't." He clicked to another slide showing a grid of faces, diverse in age, ethnicity, expression. "Most importantly, we include the experiences our culture tends to erase, the void NDEs where there's nothing but emptiness, the hellish experiences that make up a significant minority of cases, the ones with no religious content whatsoever." "Depressing," muttered someone. "Honest," Franklin corrected. "What bothers me about how film and television handle NDEs is that we've created a feedback loop. We show the same elements, the tunnel, the light, the life review, until they become what people expect, what they remember, what they report. We've created a cultural script that influences even the experience itself." The room was quiet now. Franklin had their attention. The BBC documentary, The Day I Died, presented serious scientific investigation alongside first-hand accounts. HBO's Life After Death examined both believers and skeptics with equal rigor. But for every thoughtful exploration, there are a dozen sensationalist reality shows treating NDEs as ghost stories or divine proof. He switched to the final slide, a striking image of a hospital patient hovering above their own body, perspective split between clinical reality and subjective experience. Our series won't tell viewers what to believe. It will show them the full landscape of these experiences, the science, the spirituality, the messy human reality, and it will acknowledge what all the research shows. These experiences, whatever their cause, profoundly change people. The executives exchanged glances. The woman who had spoken earlier leaned forward. "I'm intrigued, but concerned about audience appeal. Most viewers want reassurance, not complexity." The Good Place worked because it balanced philosophical questions with comedy. "How will you make existential uncertainty entertaining?" Franklin sat down, folding his hands. "The same way 6 Feet Under made death entertaining, by making it authentic. The same way Black Mirror makes technological dystopia entertaining, by grounding it in recognizable humanity." He paused. "And the same way Lost kept viewers returning despite its mysteries, by making them care about the characters facing those mysteries." Later, walking back to his car in the rain, Franklin's assistant scrolled through her notes. "So they're interested, but want to see scripts for the first 3 episodes and a detailed series Bible," she summarized. "Plus, they're concerned about the budget for the visionary sequences. They would." Franklin nodded, watching raindrops race down the glass of a display case featuring costumes from the studio's latest superhero blockbuster. "Did you notice," he said quietly, "how every person in that room had a story? The woman who mentioned her uncle's experience during heart surgery. The guy who talked about his friend's DMT trip feeling like an NDE. The younger exec who admitted reading NDE forums online because they comfort him." He stopped, turning to face his assistant. "That's why this will work. Underneath the skepticism, the cynicism, the market analysis, people are drawn to these stories. They want to believe there's more. Or at least, they want to explore the possibility." As they reached the limousine, a billboard across the street caught Franklin's attention. A new streaming documentary series promising to expose the truth behind famous NDE accounts. The tagline read, "Science versus Spirituality, the Final Frontier." Franklin smiled ruefully. "See that? Even the debunkers rely on the same tropes, the same dramatic framework. Nobody approaches this topic neutrally." The driver opened the door, and Franklin slid into the cool leather interior. As they pulled away from the studio, he gazed out at the Los Angeles skyline, shrouded in mist. "The truth is," he said, more to himself than his assistant, "we've created a cultural mythology around NDEs, parts based in documented experiences, parts embellished through repetition, parts invented for narrative convenience. And that mythology now shapes how people understand, remember, and report their own experiences." He tapped his portfolio, where the outline for Threshold waited. "Our job isn't to reinforce that mythology or to tear it down. It's to expand it, to show all the stories, even the ones that don't fit neatly into what we've collectively decided an NDE should be." The limousine merged onto the freeway, its headlights cutting through the rain. On the radio, a talk show host was interviewing a woman about her best-selling memoir, describing her journey to the other side during a cardiac arrest. "Tell us about the tunnel," the host prompted. "It was just like they say," the woman replied, her voice serene with certainty. "A long tunnel with the most beautiful light at the end." Franklin reached over and switched off the radio, his expression thoughtful. In the sudden silence, the rain on the roof sounded like distant applause. The glow of a laptop screen cast a ghostly blue aura across Catherine Devereaux's face as she scrolled through another thread on r/NDE. Outside her Manhattan penthouse, the city lights sparkled like earthbound stars, but her attention remained fixed on the words before her. "I saw myself from above. The doctors were working on me while I floated near the ceiling. Then came the tunnel and the light." Catherine, heiress to the Devereaux publishing fortune, had become obsessed with near-death experience forums 3 months ago, after her own brush with mortality during a sailing accident off the Amalfi Coast. Now, wrapped in cashmere and sipping 30-year-old scotch, she immersed herself in the digital afterlife ecosystem every night until dawn. "Another classic Western NDE template," she murmured, taking notes in her leather-bound journal. The Reddit community had grown to nearly 90,000 members, each post accumulating hundreds of comments, some supportive, others skeptical, many sharing similar experiences. Catherine switched platforms, opening YouTube where a recommended video appeared. "I died for 7 minutes, my journey to heaven and back." The thumbnail showed a young woman with perfect makeup, mouth agape in exaggerated awe, surrounded by ethereal photoshopped light effects. 3 million views in 5 days, Catherine noted with a raised eyebrow. She clicked play, watching as the influencer, barely 20, described, floating above her body during a severe allergic reaction. The story hit every expected beat: the tunnel, the light, deceased relatives, a being of love, and the reluctant return. The comments section overflowed with variations of "This happened to me too," and "God is real." Catherine sighed, minimizing the window. She'd been analyzing these patterns for months now, the way NDE narratives propagated online, reinforcing and reshaping themselves with each iteration. As a former anthropology professor before inheriting her family's wealth, she recognized the fascinating dynamics of digital folklore in real time. Her phone chimed with a notification from TikTok. One of her saved searches, #NDExperience, had new content. She opened the app to find a 59-second video of a teenager dramatically recounting how he died during appendix surgery. The video already had 1.7 million views and was accumulating more by the second. "Go to the light, bro," read one comment with thousands of likes. "Did you see Harambe in heaven?" asked another, followed by laugh emojis. Catherine took another sip of scotch, feeling the familiar burn. The meme-ification of near-death experiences was perhaps inevitable in the internet age. Sacred experiences reduced to catchphrases, inside jokes, and viral content. "Go toward the light" had become shorthand, entering the cultural lexicon alongside "I see dead people" and other pop culture references to mortality. She switched to the NDE forums, Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, where accounts tended to be longer, more detailed, and subjected to greater scrutiny. The site had accumulated thousands of testimonies over decades, translated from dozens of languages. Here, at least, there were attempts at verification, medical details, timestamps, and follow-up interviews. But even here, patterns emerged that troubled Catherine's analytical mind. Across her multiple monitors, she pulled up data visualizations she'd been working on, frequency of specific NDE elements by year, by country of origin, by platform. The graphs told a story of cultural contamination and narrative convergence. Western motifs, the tunnel, the life review, the being of light, were increasingly reported in non-Western accounts that historically featured different elements. A notification appeared from a private Discord server, NDE Truth Seekers, where a small community of researchers, experiencers, and skeptics maintained a more rigorous conversation. "New case study posted," wrote Dr. Maharajan, a neurologist from Mumbai. 16-year-old girl from rural Gujarat, very limited internet access, reports classic Western NDE following drowning incident, including tunnel, light, and life review, elements traditionally absent from Hindu NDEs. However, family confirms she watched American NDE testimonies on a borrowed smartphone 2 weeks prior. Catherine nodded to herself. This was the pattern she'd been tracking, the globalization of NDE scripts through digital contagion. Traditional cultural variations were being homogenized by the internet's algorithmic spread of dominant narratives. She switched back to YouTube, searching for a channel she'd been monitoring. Afterlife Explorer had grown from 10,000 to 3 million subscribers in just 18 months. The host, a charismatic former pastor named Elijah Stone, interviewed NDE experiencers while selling merchandise and supplements claiming to expand consciousness. His most recent video featured a woman claiming to have visited heaven during cardiac arrest and returned with the ability to predict the future. The comment section was filled with testimonials about his brain optimization supplements. Catherine made a note in her journal: monetization incentivizes escalation of claims. The commodification of NDEs was accelerating. Content creators competed for views with increasingly dramatic stories. "I died and met Jesus" would be followed by "I died and became Jesus," as the attention economy demanded ever more spectacular narratives. A Reddit notification drew her attention. A new "Ask Me Anything" thread had just gone live. "I died for 13 minutes during surgery and went to hell. AMA." Catherine clicked through. The post already had thousands of upvotes and comments within minutes. Distressing NDEs were relatively rare in the literature, perhaps 15% of reported cases, but they attracted disproportionate attention online. The original poster was answering questions rapidly. "No, I didn't see Satan with horns. It was more like being judged by a presence. Yes, I'm more religious now. I pray every day." No medical explanation was given. Doctors said my experience was impossible. Catherine scrolled through the user's previous posts and comments, a technique she developed to assess credibility. What she found was revealing. The same user had posted in a screenwriting subreddit 3 weeks earlier about working on a script about a hellish near-death experience and asking for feedback. She took a screenshot and posted it to the NDE Truth Seekers Discord with a simple comment, "Another one for the hoax file." Within moments, replies appeared. "Good catch. Third fake AMA this week." The pattern is always the same: impossible medical claims, selective responses. Catherine leaned back in her chair, gazing out at the city skyline. The internet had democratized near-death narratives, allowing anyone to share their experience with the world. This had tremendous value, creating community for genuine experiencers, advancing research through case collection, breaking the taboo around death discussions. But that same democratization had created an environment where verification was nearly impossible, where narrative templates contaminated genuine recall, where algorithmic amplification favored certain story elements over others, and where monetization incentivized exaggeration. She opened her email to find a message from Dr. Landon, a neuroscientist she'd been corresponding with. "Catherine, thought you'd find this interesting. We're seeing NDE reports from teenagers that incorporate elements from popular video games, specifically from Spiritfarers and Journey. These elements, specific types of boats, certain cloth beings, never appeared in pre-2010 accounts. Clear evidence of cultural contamination. Would you be interested in co-authoring a paper?" She wrote back immediately. "Absolutely. I've been tracking similar patterns across platforms." Her phone buzzed with a TikTok notification. A clip from a podcast interview with a celebrity who'd had an NDE during childbirth had gone viral. 8 million views in 3 hours. The comments were filled with users tagging friends. "This is exactly like what I told you happened to me." Catherine switched back to the r/skeptic subreddit, where a thread analyzed a prominent YouTuber's NDE claims against medical reality. The discussion was heated but substantive. Users with medical backgrounds pointing out physiological impossibilities in the narrative, while others argued for the limitations of current scientific understanding. She made another entry in her journal. Digital communities serve as both validation mechanisms and contamination vectors. Catherine stood up and stretched, walking to the window of her penthouse. The city below was a constellation of lights and shadows. Somewhere in those buildings, thousands of people were consuming and creating NDE content. Some seeking comfort about death, others exploiting fear for profit, many simply curious about what might await them at life's end. The democratization of this profound human experience had created something unprecedented, a global conversation about mortality, consciousness, and meaning, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. But it had also created a cacophony where genuine voices struggled to be heard above the algorithmic amplification of the sensational. She returned to her desk and opened a private document titled "Digital Afterlife: The Internet's Reshaping of Near-Death Narratives." It was approaching 300 pages now, her analysis of how online communities had fundamentally altered both the reporting and experience of NDEs. Catherine clicked to the final paragraph she'd written the previous night. Perhaps most profound is the feedback loop between experience and expectation. As standardized NDE narratives proliferate online, they shape the expectations of those who later have such experiences, potentially influencing memory formation during the compromised consciousness of a near-death state. The internet hasn't just changed how we talk about these experiences, it may have changed the experiences themselves. She took another sip of scotch and began typing again, adding to her growing manuscript as dawn approached, cataloging how humanity's oldest questions about death were being transformed by our newest technologies. One viral video, one Reddit thread, one TikTok at a time. The winter sunlight slanted through the tall windows of the Somerset Foundation Library, casting pale golden rectangles across leather-bound volumes and polished oak tables. Dr. Elizabeth Cartwright adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and arranged her notes with careful precision, color-coded tabs marking different categories of evidence. A fire crackled in the marble hearth, the only sound besides the occasional turning of pages as the small gathering of researchers waited for her to begin. The Foundation's quarterly symposium had drawn an exclusive audience: neurologists, philosophers, religious scholars, and one particularly wealthy patron whose interest in consciousness studies had funded their work for the past decade. After reviewing thousands of case studies and hundreds of papers, Elizabeth began, her voice measured and clear. We can now present what I believe is an honest epistemological framework for discussing near-death experiences. She touched a small remote, and behind her, the projection screen illuminated with a simple header, well-established findings. First, what do we know with reasonable certainty? She paused, allowing the question to settle. NDEs are remarkably common, occurring in approximately 10 to 20% of cardiac arrest survivors across multiple studies. The core phenomenology, a profound sense of peace, out-of-body sensations, movement through darkness or tunnels, encounters with light, appears with striking consistency. Elizabeth advanced to an image showing brain scans alongside EEG readings. These experiences transcend cultural boundaries, though they're invariably colored by the experiencer's background. A devout Hindu may encounter deities from the Hindu pantheon, while a secular Westerner might interpret the light as a natural phenomenon. Yet the architecture of the experience remains consistent, like different cultural decorations adorning the same fundamental structure. From the back of the room, Richard Somerset III cleared his throat. The billionaire philanthropist leaned forward in his chair, his silver hair catching the firelight. And the psychological after-effects? Are they as consistent as the reports suggest? Elizabeth nodded, appreciative of the question. Remarkably so. We have longitudinal studies spanning decades showing profound and lasting psychological transformations. Decreased fear of death, increased compassion, shifts in values away from materialism toward connection and meaning. The effect is so reliable that some researchers have suggested NDEs as potential therapeutic interventions for existential distress. She advanced the slide to show a complex neural network diagram. We also have plausible neurobiological mechanisms for many, though not all features, of NDEs. Oxygen deprivation, neurotransmitter cascades, and temporal lobe activity can explain aspects of these experiences. REM intrusion, where dreamlike states penetrate waking consciousness during crisis, offers another partial explanation. The room remained attentive as she touched the remote again. The screen changed to contested claims. Now we enter murkier territory, Elizabeth said, her tone shifting subtly. Several key aspects remain vigorously debated within the scientific community. She began to pace slowly along the edge of the antique Persian rug. The precise timing of these experiences relative to brain activity remains a critical unresolved question. Proponents of survival models argue that some experiences occur during flat EEG readings, suggesting consciousness independent of brain function. Critics counter that experiences likely happen during recovery or just before cardiac arrest, when the brain still functions or is beginning to recover. Professor Hawthorne, a neurologist from Cambridge, nodded thoughtfully. And the veridical perception cases? He asked. Precisely my next point, Elizabeth responded. The frequency and quality of veridical perception, where experiencers report accurately observing events during cardiac arrest, remains contested. While compelling anecdotes exist, controlled studies like AWARE have yet to produce unambiguous verification of visual perception during documented unconsciousness. She advanced to an image of a congenitally blind person's brain scan. Similarly contested is the nature of visual NDEs reported by congenitally blind patients. These individuals describe seeing for the first time during their NDEs, which some interpret as evidence for non-physical perception. However, we still don't fully understand how congenitally blind brains process spatial information or whether internal visual imagery might be possible without external sight experience. The fire popped loudly, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. And finally, Elizabeth continued, the prevalence and interpretation of void NDEs and distressing experiences remains underexplored. These challenging cases where experiencers report emptiness, terror, or negative encounters rather than the typical blissful narrative have received far less research attention, potentially skewing our understanding. She touched the remote again. The screen displayed highly speculative claims. Now we reach the outer boundaries of evidence, Elizabeth said, her voice dropping slightly. Here we find claims that, while potentially profound, rest on much weaker evidential foundations. Richard Somerset III leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes never leaving Elizabeth's face. The interpretation of NDEs as definitive proof of an afterlife or non-local consciousness extends beyond current evidence. While NDEs certainly suggest interesting questions about consciousness, the leap to survival of death requires assumptions that transcend available data. She gestured toward a chemical diagram on the screen. Similarly speculative is the DMT hypothesis, the notion that large endogenous DMT surges at death primarily cause NDE phenomena. While chemically induced experiences share features with NDEs, we lack evidence for substantial DMT release in dying human brains. Elizabeth paused, taking a sip of water. And lastly, strong survivalist conclusions from isolated medical cases where patients report extensive experiences during periods of apparent brain inactivity require caution. These cases, while fascinating, often lack the comprehensive monitoring needed to exclude all neural activity or to precisely time the experiences. The winter light was fading now, casting the library into deeper shadows. An assistant quietly moved around the room, turning on brass reading lamps that cast pools of warm light. "This brings us to the frontier," Elizabeth said, advancing to a slide labeled Outstanding Questions. "Future research demands methodological innovations. Continuous monitoring with advanced EEG and other technologies might resolve timing questions. Better target experiments could test veridical perception claims more rigorously." She gestured expressively, warming to this section. "We need large-scale cross-cultural and longitudinal studies that capture the full diversity of NDEs across backgrounds and across time. And critically, we need integration with broader consciousness science, connecting NDE research with work on altered states, attention, and self-representation." The room had grown still, the assembled researchers and their patron absorbed in the careful dissection of evidence. "Which brings me to my final point," Elizabeth said, her voice taking on a more personal quality. "How should we read NDE evidence responsibly?" The screen changed to show a balanced scale. "We must distinguish subjective meaning from objective proof. An experience can be deeply meaningful, transformative, and real to the experiencer without necessarily proving particular metaphysical claims about reality." Richard Somerset III nodded slowly. 20 years earlier, his own cardiac arrest on his yacht in the Mediterranean had sparked his interest in this field and his subsequent philanthropy. "We can and should hold space for experiencers' subjective realities while maintaining scientific rigor," Elizabeth continued. "Their experiences are authentic and significant regardless of their ultimate explanation." She switched off the projection and turned fully to face her audience. "NDEs happen. They transform lives. They raise profound questions about consciousness. These facts are well established. But whether they represent glimpses of an afterlife, artifacts of a dying brain, or something else entirely remains an open question, one that demands intellectual humility from all sides." Professor Hawthorne cleared his throat. "And your personal conclusion, Dr. Cartwright, after all these years studying the evidence?" Elizabeth smiled slightly. I believe NDEs reveal something profound about consciousness, that our subjective experience is more complex and mysterious than our current models suggest. Beyond that, I maintain what I call disciplined agnosticism. The evidence doesn't yet justify certainty in any direction. Richard Somerset rose from his chair and approached the fireplace, his silhouette tall against the flames. When I died, or nearly died, off the coast of Sicily, he said quietly, I experienced something that changed me forever. Was it proof of heaven? I don't know. But it was proof that consciousness is stranger and more beautiful than I had imagined. He turned to face the assembled researchers. That's why this work matters. Not because it will prove or disprove an afterlife, but because it expands our understanding of what it means to be conscious, to be human. Elizabeth nodded, gathering her notes. Which brings us back to our research subject from this morning's session. Elise Thornfield, standing at that same threshold between worlds, trying to make meaning of what she experienced. Outside, snow had begun to fall, silent and soft against the library windows. Inside, the scholars continued their careful navigation of that most personal frontier, the boundary between life and whatever might lie beyond. The truth is, I don't need you to believe me, she says, voice calm but resolute. I know what I experienced. Across from me, Dr. Catherine Chen sits in a leather armchair, hands resting lightly on her knees. The late afternoon light filters through Venetian blinds, casting gold-striped shadows across her face. 3 years ago, she flatlined for 6 minutes during a routine surgery gone wrong. Now, at 52, the Harvard-educated neurologist studies the very phenomenon she experienced. It changed me, she continues, her gaze drifting to the window where the Manhattan skyline glows in the distance. I'm less afraid, more present, more convinced there's something beyond this. A pause, then a small smile. But I also know I can't prove it to you. Not in the way we demand proof in my field. Outside, the wind picks up, rustling autumn leaves against the glass. I consider her words, weighing them against the hours of interviews we've conducted, the mountains of research papers I've reviewed, the competing theories from skeptics and believers alike. You're not alone in that position, I offer. No, she agrees, I'm in quite crowded company. Yes, indeed. Millions have glimpsed something at the edge of death, a light, a void, a presence. The radiologist in Phoenix who saw his deceased father waiting in a field of impossible colors. The atheist professor in Oslo who encountered what she could only describe as pure consciousness during cardiac arrest. The 7-year-old in Mumbai who accurately described surgical instruments and conversations while clinically dead. Science offers plausible explanations. Oxygen deprivation. Surge of neurotransmitters. The brain's final desperate attempt to make meaning as systems fail. Medicine points to endorphins, temporal lobe anomalies, REM intrusions. All compelling, all supported by evidence. Philosophy reminds us of the limits of certainty, that consciousness itself remains the hard problem, the explanatory gap between neural firing and subjective experience. That perhaps we lack the cognitive architecture to fully comprehend our own minds, let alone what lies beyond them. Religion offers comfort or warning, depending on tradition. The heavens and hells of 1,000 cultures echo in these accounts, yet transcend them in curious ways. The universal elements, the light, the review, the boundary, appear in accounts from secularists and believers alike, challenging simple religious categorization. None fully captures the experience. The recorder between us continues its silent vigil, red light blinking. Dr. Chen takes a sip of tea, now cold. Neither of us speaks for a moment. In that silence, lives the tension of our subject, the most universal human experience that no living person can claim with certainty to understand. We stand at the boundary, looking into the unknown, I say finally, voicing what has become increasingly clear throughout this investigation. We bring our best tools, neuroscience, philosophy, phenomenology, but they can only take us so far. Dr. Chen nods. Maybe it's just the brain's final fireworks, she says. Maybe it's the soul slipping free. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Her voice remains measured, professional, but there's a depth to it that wasn't there before her experience. What we know is this: in that moment, something happens. And those who return are never quite the same. I think of the patterns we've uncovered, how near-death experiencers across cultures show measurable shifts in psychological profiles, lower fear of death, increased empathy, greater appreciation for life, reduced materialism. The experience rewrites not just their beliefs, but their behaviors, their values, their relationships. Whether it's glimpsing eternity or simply confronting mortality in a profound way, the change is real. The evidence suggests certain boundaries to what we can claim, I say. We can say with confidence that these experiences occur cross-culturally and throughout history, that they follow recognizable patterns with individual variations, that they transform lives, that current neuroscientific models neither fully explain nor dismiss them. A taxi honks 14 stories below. The city continues its relentless rhythm while we contemplate the boundary between being and non-being, knowing and mystery. What we can't say with certainty is what they ultimately mean, I continue. Whether consciousness can exist independent of the brain. Whether these glimpses reveal something that awaits us all or something uniquely created in the moment of crisis. Dr. Chen smiles, a genuine expression that reaches her eyes. And perhaps that's the point, she says. Perhaps the uncertainty itself is valuable. It keeps us humble, keeps us questioning. I recall the words of Dr. Bruce Grayson, who spent decades documenting thousands of cases. If we want to understand NDEs, we need the humility to acknowledge their depth and meaning without overstating what they prove. Or Sam Parnia, whose AWARE studies sought verifiable out-of-body perceptions during cardiac arrest. We stand at the threshold of understanding consciousness in ways that may transform our conception of what it means to be human. The shadows have lengthened across the room. Our interview, the final one for this investigation, is drawing to a close. I gather my notes, thinking of how to synthesize everything we've covered. For those listening who want to explore further, Dr. Chen offers, setting down her cup, there are resources worth considering. She recommends the peer-reviewed work of the International Association for Near-Death Studies for those seeking scholarly perspectives, the Grayson Scale for clinicians working with patients who report these experiences, the integration workshops pioneered by Noyes and Sartori for experiencers struggling with after effects, the philosophical analyses of Keith Augustine and Carl Becker for those wrestling with materialist and dualist interpretations. And for those who've had an NDE and feel alone, I ask? Tell them they aren't, she says firmly. Millions have walked this path. Finding community, whether online or in person, can make all the difference. The experience may be ineffable, but the aftermath doesn't have to be solitary. I think of the online forums where experiencers share their stories, the Facebook groups with tens of thousands of members, the Reddit communities where anonymous accounts describe lights and tunnels and beings. For all the potential for misinformation, these spaces provide validation for experiences often dismissed in medical settings. As I pack up my equipment, Dr. Chen moves to the window. The city lights are emerging now as dusk settles. For a moment, she simply watches, her silhouette sharp against the panorama of human creation, skyscrapers and bridges, the vast architecture of civilization built by beings who, in the end, still don't understand their own consciousness. I went into neuroscience because I wanted certainty, she says, not turning from the view. I wanted the satisfaction of mapping the mind, reducing mystery to mechanism. My experience didn't give me certainty, it took it away. And yet, she turns now, her expression serene. I wouldn't trade that loss for anything. There's something liberating in standing at the edge, in acknowledging both what we know and what we don't. I think of how we began this journey with the raw, subjective reality of the experience itself. The light, the boundary, the sense of being both within and beyond the self. We've examined the science, traced the history, weighed the evidence. We've heard from critics and proponents, from researchers and experiencers. And now we end where we began, with the fundamental question that has haunted humanity since we gained the capacity for self-reflection. What happens when we die? What lies beyond the threshold of our earthly existence? We still don't know, not with the certainty we crave, not with the evidence that would satisfy our most rigorous standards of proof. But perhaps, as Dr. Chen suggests, that uncertainty itself has value. Perhaps it keeps us searching, keeps us humble, keeps us open to wonder. The recorder stops. The interview ends, but the question remains unanswered yet endlessly worth asking. As I leave the building and step into the cool evening air, I look up. Between the towers of glass and steel, a sliver of sky appears, scattered with the first stars of night. I think of all who have contemplated these same stars, who have wondered about what awaits, who have returned from the threshold with stories both unprovable and undeniable. What really happened in those moments between life and death, we still don't know. And perhaps that's the point.